conversation.
Just remind everybody we are recording.
Nice.
Okay, welcome everybody. We have a very exciting speaker today, and you know, I think everyone will really enjoy it. Next week is the board meeting, so don't go to the church. And we're on Zoom. If you want to come to the board meeting, just send us an email at ssccsite@gmail.com and we will give you the link. We had a last minute change in the competition. Our judge at the last minute, I guess, forgot he was having cataract surgery that day. So
That will help my images.
he won't
Of all
he's not
things,
gonna
right?
change that. So we had to get a judge on Zoom. We couldn't get another one in person. So unfortunately, that first competition will be on Zoom. So we'll send out a couple of reminders just to make sure people know that. And the deadline for the competition is tonight.
Yeah.
So by 11 o'clock, make sure your pictures are in. Let's see, just wanted to remind people the beginners group is next Saturday, 9/28 at 10 o'clock at Harbor Park in Marshfield. If you get, make sure you get the updates because everything is included in there. And Regina always goes above and beyond of making sure people have all the information and directions and everything else. So for any of the beginners, it's a great opportunity to get together with people who, you know, are starting out like you are, with also other people who have had more experience and are willing to share that experience. Just to let people know, the Quincy project is now in the hands of Julia. We had over 30 people participate, and that's really, it's great, the supportiveness and the involvement. We had that, and the Q Gallery, we had 40 people participated. That's really what makes this club exciting. Also, actually tonight we have a very sad note.
Pass fast.
Is someone, you might want to shut off your mics now.
Yeah, if everybody could mute. Thank you.
So if you can mute yourself, and then you can shut off your video also. But we had a very sad note. Pat Fay has passed away. Most members who have been in the club for any length of time remember Pat. Pat was a huge part of the club. Her and Larry really, you know, were the beginnings of what the club is today. Pat ran the F-Stop Cafe, provided food to the whole group. She was a longtime board member. And like I said, her and Larry was president for many, many years, and they really put their heart and souls of the club. So it's very sad to lose Pat like this. And I don't think Larry is doing that well. We will send out the information on that once we find it out. All right, so hopefully, do we have Kevin on? We don't.
Probably not. So what I was thinking is, if he does get on, I was thinking during our break, maybe he can do his announcements.
Okay,
happens.
Dan, once again, we're great to have Dan here because he does the MC and keeps control of this whole thing.
Right.
I do have Stephanie's information, so I can do a brief introduction. We're very excited to have Stephanie. If you got a chance to look, and if you haven't had a chance, definitely look at her work. It is amazing. Stephanie is a self-taught photographer. She honed her ICM technique by getting out to do the work as often as possible. She has a bachelor's of arts degree and graduate work in English literature, and has always had a very strong emotional connection to the natural world and to art in all of its various forms. Stephanie has a deep passion for creating uniquely artistic images by working with camera movement to paint how any given scene feels for her at the moment. She brings an interconnected, creative, and intuitive approach to her photography as art to visually express the essence of light, color, form, line, texture, mood, emotion, and more. Stephanie is the founder, creator, and publisher of ICM Photography Magazine, a first of its kind e-magazine dedicated solely to featuring ICM images, articles, reviews, interviews, tips, and tutorials by ICM photographers and artists around the world in a quarterly feature-packed digital format. The past 5 years of Stephanie's photographic career have been solely dedicated to ICM work, and she has a strong desire to build a larger community around it, one that will also help give exposure and voice to other photographers who have been dedicated to perfecting their own ICM techniques. Hopefully everybody's muted and shut your videos off, and we're very excited to have you join us, Stephanie.
Well, thank you.
And I think Kevin just came on. Kevin, I just gave you, is he on? That's all right. He'll eventually, he's coming on. But since I did the introduction, you can begin, Stephanie. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Betty. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Make sure I have sound share turned on, because I do have a couple of videos that I want to share with you as well. But thank you so much for the warm welcome and the opportunity to share my passion for ICM photography with the South Shore Camera Club. I have been, as Betty mentioned, primarily focused on intentional camera movement and multiple exposure ICM for several years. It has been my passion, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I came to doing ICM and why I got into doing ICM. But I wanted to first share just a quick little 2-minute video just for some creative inspiration to get things kicked off, to show you what's possible with your camera. All of the work that you'll see in this short video has been created in the camera. And so hopefully it'll just give you a taste of what's to come in the rest of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and play that now, and then we'll get into the actual presentation. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of inspiration of the things you can do with your camera. And I will say also that I've given Betty a link to a Google Drive folder which contains my presentation as a PDF, so that you can download and keep a copy of it if you would like. And on these slides that have videos, you can click on the image and it will open that video up on my YouTube channel. So if you wanted to watch the video again, you certainly can do that by clicking on the image on that slide. So this is an outline of the things that I plan to talk about this evening. I will kind of walk you through my journey towards this more creative approach, talk about some of the basics of ICM. I want to talk about single exposure, considered multiple exposures and mobile ICMs, because those are all of the ways that I work with ICM. And I came to ICM in early 2017, and then by 2018, I was fully invested in going out with my camera and only working with ICM. I was originally a traditional landscape photographer. That's what I always considered myself to be. And I started traveling in 2015 after going through a divorce. After 24 years of marriage, I started traveling to Ireland every 2 or 3 months for the next 2.5 years, just to go and shoot the magnificent landscapes and immerse myself in the magnificent landscapes there in Ireland. But every time I'd come back to Iowa, which is where I live, and I've been in Iowa for about 20 years. I grew up in Texas and I've lived all over, but I have been in Iowa for about 20 years. I'd come back from Ireland and I'd have a hard time getting out with my camera in the landscapes of Iowa. I hadn't made that, special connection with the local landscape, and it certainly isn't as magnificent and grand as the landscapes in Ireland. And in 2017, I started to see ICM actually for the first time. And I also read a book by Canadian photographer David Duchemin called A Beautiful Anarchy. And in that book, he talks about the idea that you have to do the work. And as Betty mentioned, when she read my introduction, my bio, that is something that I'm very passionate about. And it's become my mantra that you have to do the work. You can't wait for inspiration to hit. You have to just get out and do the work. And in the doing of the work, inspiration comes. So I took that idea, that concept, and the idea of just getting out and playing with my camera, using intentional camera movement to connect with the Iowa landscape in a much different way than I had previously. I started to see the potential to create these very artistic images that represented more of an inner creative vision that I have, because abstraction is not a foreign concept for me. I grew up in an artistic home. I played musical instruments. I love literature, and literature can be very abstract. And my stepfather, who raised me, was an abstract painter as well. So ICM really kind of resonated with me on a very deep level within my inner creative spirit. So as I started to get out into the landscapes of Iowa, I made more meaningful connections. And over the years, I would say that the bulk of the work that I have done with ICM has been done within a 30 to 50 mile radius of where I live. Certainly, it's nice to be able to travel and go to these other locations like Ireland, and I do travel a lot to the UK now and around the United States, teaching workshops and talking about ICM, sharing about ICM. And it's nice to be able to go to these locations and create using ICM to reimagine those locations in different ways. But I really still feel like I do the best work in the local landscape around where I live, because I have a much deeper connection to that landscape. And it's a landscape that I've gone to over and over and over again. I've become so intimately familiar with it that it really, just fosters this idea of deep connection. And so just a little bit about ICM. For me, it is a creative process. It certainly is a technique. It's a way to use your camera. It's a tool that you can use with your camera, but it's also a creative process. For me, it's a form of artistic expression. And I do feel like ICM asks us to let go of so many of the things that we've learned in photography previously, like rules or perfectionism, sharpness, an idea that there's a right or a wrong way to do it, because there is no right or wrong way with ICM. If it works for you, then it's right for you, but that may not necessarily work in the same way for someone else. So it's a very individualized form of artistic expression, and each person has to just get out and do the work and find what works best for them. And I do feel like if we work with ICM and put in a lot of time and energy and effort into playing with ICM, we can learn to refine our processes and also to see the potential of any given scene or any given situation. Hello? Did somebody have a question? So, I really do think that if you're just going out on occasion and working with ICM or working with ICM kind of as an afterthought, then you may not evolve it or expand it or grow it in quite the same way as you would if you were going out on a regular basis and just dedicating time to working with ICM, to playing with ICM. And so that's certainly the approach that I have had over the years, is that I just go out, I dedicate all of my time. Not to say that every photographer is going to dedicate all of their time and energy to doing ICM, but having a dedicated practice that involves ICM, I think will be beneficial to expanding the artistry with it. And so just at a basic level, ICM is a very intentional process of moving the camera during the exposure of an image. But it can also be, in the case of multiple exposure ICMs or just multiple exposures in general, it can also be a process of moving the camera in between exposures. So I'll show some images later on in the presentation where I'm moving the camera in between exposures. It's generally using a slower shutter speed. I started out using at a 1/13 of a second shutter speed. So I do feel like starting out around 1/10 of a second, maybe even slower, is a good place to start. I do now work more regularly with a 1/2 second shutter speed, but you have to experiment and try different shutter speeds. And I still experiment and play with other shutter speeds. I don't always only shoot at a 1/2 second. I try a lot of different things, but a 1/2 second really works well for me for most of the things that I want to create. But again, experiment, play, have fun with it, and see what happens. It's more than just accidental camera shakes. We can surely go out and create some images that are intriguing and interesting by accidentally moving the camera. But I truly believe that ICM and the perfection of it, and I don't even really like that word perfection, because perfection means that it can't be improved upon, and you can always improve upon anything you do. But to really, get to grips with it is going to take a very intentional act of creation. For me, I feel like controlling the shutter speed is more important than controlling the aperture. I don't generally care what the aperture is. I shoot regularly at about at f/32, if that's what the conditions call for. But some ICM photographers out there will say that aperture priority or aperture is what they are concerned with. I'm not concerned with aperture. So you have to decide for yourself, what's more important. I want to know that when I press the shutter, because I get into a flow and I just click, 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 I'm in a flow, and I want to know that my shutter speed I'm working with the shutter speed I want to work with. And if I'm an aperture priority, that's going to change. If I'm over here and the light's over here, it might not be a 1/2 second. It might be 1/250th of a second, and so I feel like controlling the shutter speed, if you're not comfortable shooting in manual mode, shooting in shutter priority would be the most preferable. I do shoot in manual mode. I'm making my own adjustments to aperture, ISO, shutter speed as I'm working a particular scene. Also, experimenting with different focal lengths is important, because if you want to create the same effect in two different images where you're shooting one at 24 millimeters and one at 200 millimeters, to achieve the same effect, you might have to move the camera differently at each different focal length. You might have to move the camera more or faster or bigger than you would if you were at 200 millimeters. So understanding how focal length has an effect on the end result is also important. And then different sizes and speeds of movements are going to also create different kinds of effects. So just playing with a lot of different things, focal lengths, settings, sizes, and speeds of movement is really, really important. And there is no right or wrong way to do ICM. Again, if it works for you, then it's right for you, but that might be different for someone else. So just keep that in mind, that it really is a very individualized way of working with the camera, and only you can know for sure what is working for you. These are some of the different types of movements you can use, and I won't go over this list in detail because the next slide is a video where it shows how I do move the camera in a lot of these different ways, and then I'll talk about the movements as we go through some slides as well. And you can study this slide if you download the presentation, but just keep in mind, again, there's no right or wrong way, and you're really only limited by your own imagination. And so if you can think of a way to move the camera, try it and see what happens. You're not going to lose anything. The only thing you will lose is if you don't try it, because then you've lost an opportunity to see what might happen. So this next slide is a video, and again, you can click on it if you download the presentation and watch the video again on my YouTube channel, but I'll go ahead and play it here. There's no talking, it's just music, and it's about 3 minutes long, I think. So I'll play this video and then we'll get into some looking at some images. So hopefully that was helpful to see how I work with the camera out in different kinds of field and environments. I do hold the camera out in front of me, but you could use the viewfinder. I know a lot of ICM photographers who do use the viewfinder to do their ICMs, but for me, I just like the freedom of being able to flow, and it's almost like dancing with my camera, really, you know, and it's hard to do that. It's a little bit more restrictive when you're holding the camera up against against your face and looking through the viewfinder. And I do want to say too that if you have any questions as I go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I can keep an eye on that and answer them as we go along as well. But the first thing I want to talk about is single exposure ICM. I feel like it's really important to have an understanding and a firm foundation of ICM by starting out to work with single exposures as opposed to starting out doing multiple exposure ICMs, because you will learn more about how the different combinations of factors create different results better, I think, if you're working with single exposure. And I did only do single exposure. For the first 5 years I was doing ICM, I didn't do multiple exposure at all. Even though I had the ability in my camera to do it, I just never did do it. I only did single exposure. And so this slide here is with trees, and trees is a great subject to get started with if you've never done ICM. It's an easy subject to work with. And this slide shows how different types of movements are going to create different kinds of effects working with trees. But certainly that holds true with any particular subject. If you're using the same subject and making all of these different kinds of movements with that same subject, you will get all these different kinds of results. But straight vertical motion, whether you start at the top and go down, or whether you start at the bottom and go up, vertical motion follows the lines of the trees. But in the video you saw I was doing a wavy S-curve motion, and this image on the top row in the center is an image from that particular outing where I was doing this very tight S-curve motion. The circular shaking motion, that's just something like this, where I'm basically shaking in a circular motion to create a more impressionistic look and feel. Diagonal, you could go from top right to bottom left, top left to bottom right. You could start at the bottom and go up. It's really up to you. And then zooming, certainly you can zoom the lens and zoom and move the camera at the same time. This particular zoom was one that was done on a tripod, so you get those very straight lines. If you're zooming and moving the camera, you're going to get wavier lines. And then a horizontal wavy motion, so something like this, where it's just waving the camera as you're going across on a horizontal trajectory. Edward asked, do you focus the camera before the movement? I generally do, especially if I'm working with trees or a subject like this. If I'm in working a sunset scene, like you saw in the video where I'm standing on the side of a lake and I'm shooting the sunset off in the distance, I will generally, for that particular kind of situation, put the lens on the infinity mark so that I don't have to worry about the focus, even if I'm changing the focal length, because the sun sets off in the distance, and having it set to the infinity mark means that even if I change the focal length, the focus is going to stay in focus. But when I'm working with a subject like the trees, things are in different things are closer and farther away. So I will pick something, and I don't necessarily have a rule of thumb what to pick necessarily. It might be something closer, it might be something in the midground, it might be something in the background. It just depends.
Can you make that softer?
Somebody has a question? Okay. So these are some of those different types of movements and the effects that come from that. So these two images are using that vertical motion. And the thing I want to point out here is that early on, when I first started doing ICM, I started out just using a small little compact point and shoot camera. And so I didn't even start using my big camera, my DSLR, until after I'd already been getting out with the small camera and playing and experimenting and allowing myself to be free, because it can be a little intimidating for most of us who have been taught that images have to be sharp, and you've got to keep the camera on a tripod to get the sharp, crisp lines, and it can be it goes against the grain. It goes against our thought processes to think about moving the camera. So just getting out to play and working with a small camera helped to free me a little bit. And in 2017, 2018, mobile ICM wasn't really a thing. So it wasn't something I was working with a mobile device back then. This particular slide we've seen this image here. This is from the video where I was doing that very fast S-curve motion. The image on the left is also an S-curve motion, but it's a wider, looser motion. And so this is an example of same type of movement, but size and speed of movement creating different kinds of effects. The very tight S-curve motion gives you tighter, curved lines than you get with a looser motion. So again, size and speed of movement creating different kinds of effects. And then this is just a larger version of that image where I did the circular shaking motion. You can see that motion. Oftentimes you can look at ICMs and see what the movement was by looking for the lines. What are the lines doing? What is the light doing? The light that's reflecting off some of the leaves is showing that it's a circular motion for this particular image. Sunrises and sunsets. I like to do mine over water features usually. So there's a lake that I go to locally, and I do my sunrises and sunsets generally over water features, but you can do them over land features. You have to be over water. It's just that if you're working with water, if you're working in a situation where there is water, you can get some really lovely reflections of that light in the water, and the water contributes an effect to the atmosphere of the image. But again, horizontal movement, it's kind of the thing we're going to think about when we go out to shoot a sunset, is to follow the horizon line, so moving horizontally. But you don't have to follow the lines of the subject that you're working with. And so the image in the middle on the top row is a horizontal movement with a twist, so something like this. Horizontal with a wavy motion, and then just a kind of an upward diagonal sweep, and then a diagonal wavy movement to create a different kind of effect. So just trying a lot of different things and working with light. I love to work with the light before it's gone completely below the horizon. So the sun, there's still a little bit of a sliver of the sun above the horizon line, and that helps me to create some of these interesting effects. By working with that light. So I'm often shooting directly at the sunset, at the light, which means I'm most of the time underexposing as well. But I just love to be able to capture that beautiful ribbon of light across the frame, and then having just, a little hint of the dark shadow of the landscape and the reflection of the water, reflection of the light on the water. So sunsets and sunrises are always a great subject. And here's another example of that beautiful light being reflected on the water. This is just this white line through the center here. That's caused by some movement in the water. So little things that you wouldn't even probably notice or pay attention to can add some visual interest. A piece of water that's not reflecting light in the way that the rest of the water is because of the way the water might be moving. And then another sunrise ICM here, single exposure, just working with that beautiful sunlight as it's coming up above the horizon, off in the distance with a beautiful seascape. So, for me, ICM is about seeing the possibilities of any particular given scene and not necessarily waiting for anything in particular, not waiting for perfect conditions, not waiting for perfect light, not thinking that I have to have perfect gear or perfect timing, because perfect just doesn't really exist. And sometimes I just firmly believe that sometimes you just have to get out there and start moving the camera in order to see the possibilities. I don't generally pre-visualize, so I don't go out to any particular scene thinking in advance, this is what I want to create. I just go out, get in the flow of creativity and seeing what's happening and allowing it to reveal itself to me on the back of the camera. Sometimes you might not know what's going to happen. And in seeing it, by just starting to move and having the possibilities reveal themselves to you, will take you in directions that might be unexpected, or directions that you may not have even thought of when you first went out. So if you go out with the expectation that you're going to do something in particular and it doesn't manifest for you, you could walk away being frustrated because you didn't create the thing you had in your mind that you were expecting to create, and you've missed a whole load of opportunities because you didn't try anything else. And so with ICM, it really is this having this spirit of curiosity. What if I do this? What if I do that? What would happen if I did this? Okay, I've done this for a few times. Now, what if I change things up a little bit and I use a faster shutter speed, or I use a slower shutter speed, or I move the camera slower than I have been, or faster, or bigger movement? You know, it's all about just playing and exploring and experimenting and trying lots and lots of different things. And so this is just a wavy motion, working with river rapids, working with that light that is reflecting off of the rapids on this particular river. This next set of images are tall grasses, and these are holding the camera vertically and moving the camera horizontally, but incorporating that twist, a little bit of a twist, and it's that twist that helps to create that kind of rotational circular effect. Susan asked, is there a particular lens you recommend for this? No, I think any lens you have is perfect. So work with whatever you have. I'm not a gear person. I'm not somebody who is going to suggest that you have to have this particular camera or this particular lens. I won't even tell you that you have to have an ND filter. There are lots of ICM photographers out there who will say you have to have an ND filter to do ICM, and that's just not true. I did ICM without an ND filter the first 3 years just because my go-to lens, I mean, in answer to your question, I wouldn't say I recommend it, but this is the lens that I know works best for me. It's my favorite lens, 70 to 200 millimeters, but I have a 24 to 105, and I do use the 24 to 105. I use a macro lens sometimes. If I had a lens baby, I'd be trying to do ICM with a lens baby. So whatever gear you have is perfect. Do what you can with the gear that you have. Don't ever feel like you can't do something because you have to have a certain piece of gear, because I just don't subscribe to that theory or that idea. This is a field of wildflowers, and these two images are an example of how different size and speed of movement creates a completely different kind of effect. So the image on the left is a loose shaking motion. The image on the right is a very tight shaking motion. Tighter is going to blur those lines more so than a looser shaking motion. And so you get more recognizability of the subject in this loose shaking motion than you do when you're doing a very tight shaking motion. Regina asks if I turn my camera stabilization off. I don't have in-body camera stabilization, image stabilization, but I do have it in the lens, and I keep the lens and image stabilization turned off, yes. But ICM, generally, you're moving the camera a whole lot more than what image stabilization is meant for. So I don't think it really hurts if you leave it turned on. Because it's not going to correct for what the movement is anyway. And so that's one of those things that you can try and experiment with and see if there's a different effect. If it works better for you with it on or off, then you know, because you tried it and you experimented with it. And then Dawn asks, do you usually shoot in lower light, such as dusk and sunset? No, you'll see some images as we go through this where I'm shooting in the middle of the day. These grass images, actually, these are both in the middle of the day, probably 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I go out and shoot when I feel like going out to shoot, regardless of what the conditions are. I find a way to work with whatever's presented in front of me. And if that means, that subject over here, if those grasses over here and the sun, if the grasses are over here and the sun's directly behind them, and I can't get the settings that I want to work with by pointing it right there, I'm going to go this way off the sun, or I'm going to go this way away from the sun and see if I can work with those grasses. And generally I can, and so it's really just a matter. I always encourage people to find a way to work with whatever conditions are presented in front of them. And then Carmine asks, do I always use 100 ISO? I do generally, especially during the day, and for sunrise and sunset, shoot at 100 ISO. But if I'm shooting into the blue hour, or if I'm shooting the moon, because I've done ICM with the moon and lunar eclipses and things like that, I will bump it up to whatever it needs to be. It might be, 1600 or 3200. So I do try to shoot at 100 ISO if that's conducive to the conditions, but if I need to bump up the ISO, I'm not averse to doing that. So these two images here are just working with some light that's coming through breaks in clouds during a fast-moving storm, and this is just going kind of up and over, flipping the camera and trying to work with that light, because I saw the light and I just thought, oh, I love that. What can I do with it? And as I'm flipping the camera up and over and seeing these curves of light, how the light's curving through the frame, it just felt like I was bending the light. That's what it felt like to me, like I was bending the light, and that was really, really exciting. So this is an image with a macro lens, and it's a 1 second exposure. Hold the camera still for a fraction of that second, and then just a small little wave off. Hold still and wave off. Holding the camera still for a portion of the shutter speed will imprint the flower or whatever the subject is, so that you get the literal lines of that subject, but then the wave off creates these waves of light, waves of lines, so that it feels like the flower is just kind of floating through space. It gives it a much more ethereal kind of feel and look and effect. So this is another example. This is a building on the University of Iowa campus, close to where I live, and it's an example of same subject, 2 different kinds of movements creating different effects. So the image on the left is that shaking motion, so just something like this, where you're getting a more impressionistic look and feel. You see the lines of the buildings because you're just doing a shaking motion, a small shaking motion. The image on the right is a very fast sweeping panning motion, and that is blurring all of the lines of that building out completely. Everything about that building is blurred out, and it just becomes more about the layers of light, layers of color, the texture. So 2 completely different effects using the same subject, but using different types of movements. These are some urban images. I've shown mostly natural world images, but certainly you can do ICM in urban environments as well. And so the first 2 images on the left and in the center are just essentially using this shaking motion to give an impressionistic look and feel to the scene. And then the image on the right is zooming the lens during that exposure to create a different kind of effect there.
Hi, Stephanie.
Yes.
Hi, it's 7:50 right now. Do you want to take a break, or do you want to finish up your section and then we'll take a break then? What would you like to do?
I was going to take a break at the end of this multiple exposure section.
Okay. All right, no problem.
So the next thing I want to talk about are multiple exposure ICMs. And when I say multiple exposure ICMs, what I mean is I am moving the camera for each of these exposures. So if I'm doing a 2 exposure MEICM, I have moved the camera for each exposure. And then working with the different blending options, blending mode options. If your camera has this ability to use bright blend mode, dark blend mode, and average blend mode. Some cameras also have a blend mode called additive, which I do have, but I don't use it. I don't generally use it for any particular purpose at all. So these are the 3 that I like to work with: bright, dark, and average blend mode. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these different blend modes individually, but the thing with moving the camera for each of the exposures and working with the different blending modes is that you can just create these very amazing and exciting images, and then working in sequence to build them in the moment, in the field, is really, really exciting. So this is a 2 exposure, multiple exposure ICM using bright blend mode. One of the exposures I did a shaking motion. One of the exposures I just did a vertical motion. And as I was playing in this particular scene and seeing these images unfolding on the back of my camera, I just thought, wow, I'm creating a fantasy world. It felt like I was creating a scene out of Avatar. And that's so exciting. Certainly you can layer images, a shaking motion image and a vertical motion image of trees in Photoshop, and create an image similar to this by layering and blending in Photoshop. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but there's such an excitement that I feel when I do that and I see it happening in the field, in the moment, that I don't think necessarily compares in quite the same way by doing it in Photoshop. So just a comparison of the blending modes. Average blend mode is kind of like just layering exposures on top, and everything gets averaged out. So you're going to see all of the elements of each exposure. You see all of the vertical lines of the first exposure. You see all of the horizontal lines of the second exposure. But with bright blend mode, bright gets the priority across the 2 exposures, or however many exposures you're working with. So in this 2 exposure, and I did these images in sequence, I created these this MEICM in sequence. First exposure, shaking motion. Second exposure, vertical motion. Final blended image. You can see that these brighter parts of each of the exposures are what come through. This tree trunk is in shadow on the left side, and you don't see that left side shadow of the tree in the final blended image because bright gets the priority, and the area here in the first exposure is brighter than that part of the tree that's in shadow. The opposite is true in dark blend mode. Whatever's darkest across the exposures is what gets the priority. Dark gets the priority. So in this case, and we saw this in the video, I can take a blown out sky. I can take an exposure and completely blow out the sky, knowing that my second exposure, I can frame it so that I don't get any brightness at the top of the frame, that it's all, below the horizon line or below the tree line, and that darkness is going to fill in that top part of the frame because dark gets the priority. So those are the differences between average, bright, and dark blend mode. And just a couple more examples of bright blend mode where you can, and again, if you download the presentation, you can study these and have a look at them to see, what is getting the priority across the exposures to make up the final blended image. And this bottom line here is actually one where I have flipped the camera upside down for the second exposure. And I like to do that a lot, especially when I'm shooting sunsets or sunrises, because I can bring the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame to create a really unique and different kind of effect. So turning the camera upside down is a way to work work with the camera as well. And then examples of dark blend mode. Study, if you download the presentation, study what's getting the priority. You can see these dark elements right here in the first exposure are much darker than that part of the frame in the second exposure, and that's what's coming through. So you can get completely different effects by using dark blend mode as opposed to bright blend mode. And a lot of people think that you know, when you're shooting in dark blend mode, that means that everything's going to be dark, and that's not true. As long as there's nothing darker across parts of each frame, then there's nothing to take priority. So, you know, you can certainly have bright images even using dark blend mode. So just study those to see what's getting the priority and how that works. So just real quickly before we do take a break, I want to talk about two different types of multiple exposure ICMs that I work with. And these are my own terminology, the things that I've decided for myself. This is how I work, and this is what I'm going to call these. The multiple exposure sequence, where I'm doing, you know, 1, 2, and then final blended image. I'm carefully and deliberately crafting and working a scene to build the final image, to build it, to create the effect that's happening. And then the next type is what I call high frame rate, and I'll talk about that a little bit here in a second. But these are some examples of the multiple exposure sequence. These are all 2 exposures where I've done the exposures in sequence and then the final blended image. This is another one where I flipped the camera upside down to get the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. This is another one where I was working with the highlights of grasses, the way the sun was highlighting the tops of some grasses with a very dark wooded area behind the field of grasses. I love that contrast between highlights and shadows, and so that's what caught my attention, and I had to stop and play with that to create this effect that looks like light dancing. And then these are artistic, very artistic images. One, the image on the left, and this is in dark blend mode, the image on the left is just a shop entrance where there was a lot of colorful signage around the door and some colorful lights, and the image on the right is just a wall hanging in a place where I was staying. The wall itself was painted this terracotta color, and then there was a wall hanging with these oranges and greens and blues and whites that caught my attention, and I stood there for probably an hour just playing with that wall hanging, trying to create some different kinds of effects with that. And then these are day marks in Cornwall up on top of a hill. They guide ships. They tell ships that there's a cliff. So playing again with the upside down technique and working in bright blend mode to create a different kind of look and feel with this particular subject. So a couple of examples of same subject, different blend mode, because people do often ask me, how do you decide whether to use bright or dark blend mode? And I don't make a decision. I try them both. I don't walk up to a scene and say, oh, this should be bright blend mode, or oh, this should be dark blend mode, because you can absolutely do both in any given situation. So these are examples of that. The same exact scene, one using bright blend mode, one using dark blend mode, and getting 2 different kinds of effects. Do you do the blend modes in camera? Yes, I do this all in the camera. This is all blended in the camera. I could take the single exposures and put them in Photoshop and blend them there, and then I'd have a whole lot of additional blending options. But no, all of these images have been created in the camera. I don't think you can do blending in this way in Lightroom, not that I'm aware of, but you can do it in Photoshop. But the excitement for me is doing it in the field. So these 2 are examples of the Manhattan skyline, one using bright blend mode, bringing the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. The second one on the right using dark blend mode, with the river becoming the thing that's in the top and the bottom part of the frame, because the river is darker than the sky. So completely different look and feel using different blending modes, but using the same subject. This was also from that period in the video where I was at that lake where there were those lily pads, again using bright blend mode on the image on the right or on the left, and dark blend mode with the image on the right, creating a different look and feel. And then again, upside down technique, working with bright and dark blend mode to either bring the sky into the top or bottom of the frame, or the ground, the foreground, into the top of the top and bottom of the frame. So just real quick before we go on to the break, I'll show some images of this high frame rate technique that I mentioned. This is my type 2, high frame rate. And what I mean by this is generally for the high frame rate, I'm going all the way up to 9 exposures. And I am moving the camera rapidly around the scene in between the exposures. So it might be something like click, 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 click. So I'm moving the camera, I'm firing off rapidly, and I'm moving it in between the exposures. And this creates an impressionistic kind of look and feel, but it also shows the energy and the vibrancy of a scene as well. And so this is using average blend mode. I do like to use average a lot for these high frame rate techniques, and you can see all of those exposures. I probably, if I counted, this is Emerix, which is the name of this restaurant here, you know, I could count how many times it shows up, because in average blend mode I can see all of those. But in a brighter dark blend mode, that wouldn't happen. I might not be able to see all of those different signs, letters from the signs, depending on what was getting the priority. So you can also zoom while you're clicking off your frames rapidly. So click, 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 click. Zooming while you're doing the exposures as well kind of makes this whirlwind effect and creates even more energy and vibrancy of the scene. And these again are both using average blend mode. This is using bright blend mode, and you can see that there's a very distinct difference in the effect that you get using bright blend mode compared to this effect that you get with average blend mode. See, these clouds would have more of this kind of effect in this image here if it had been in bright blend mode, but because I'm in average blend mode, the clouds blend together differently than they do when you're using bright blend mode. So this is bright blend mode, and then this is using the high frame rate technique with dark blend mode. And then because the buildings are generally darker than the sky, those are the things that get blended differently in that particular kind of situation. And then this is just a floral scene at a botanical garden, just, you know, moving the camera in between, very small movements in between to create kind of a Monet-esque look and feel to this particular image. And then this one using dark blend mode, similar technique in a woodland area with some fall flowers, and creating what feels like brush strokes. That dark blend mode gives me more of an effect that feels like brush strokes than I get necessarily with average blend mode. So that is the discussion about average blend mode and dark blend mode and multiple exposure ICMs. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can take a 10-minute break, and then we can come back and I'll talk about just a few creative post-processing things I've been doing lately, and then some mobile ICMs, and then I have some before and after examples as well.
So it looks like we do have a question if you want to answer that. So
yeah,
for
the Manhattan skyline,
right,
what
yeah.
technique did I use? For the, I mean, I did the same technique, just click, 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 click. So I think they were small, they were only 4 to 5 exposures instead of 9 exposures. So, you know, just essentially moving the camera, small movements, click, 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 something like that. But when you're using bright and dark blend mode, you get a different effect, and that's what creates that that look and feel.
Right. Just real quick before, so we'll probably come back here, what, 8 do you want to come back at like 8:10 or 8:15? Stephanie, I mean,
10
like how,
after, 10 after is fine if 5 minutes is good for everybody.
yeah, I'm just thinking because how much more do you have with your presentation, just so we're not like,
Well, I did say it was about an hour and a half, and I
right.
didn't get started until it was 15 after. So I would say probably at least till quarter till.
Okay. Okay. Sure. And real quick, so Kevin is here. Do you want to do your announcements, any future presentations, presenters that we're going to be having, any kind of trips or events that everyone should know now?
Dan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, forgive me, members, and certainly Stephanie for missing the beginning. We had some serious Zoom issues. Um, but just a quick announcement for upcoming shows. In October, we have astrophotography. We have creative coastal photography. And then we also have the Quincy History Show being done by Julia Kuhn. So that's just a small list of things coming up. And we hope to keep seeing you at Club and at Zoom.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Stephanie, real quick, since we only got a couple more minutes, during your, when you were being, introduced, you were talking about, you started your own digital photography magazine. How did that start? Could you give us like kind of like a boiler on how that all started and
Um,
why you wanted to do it?
yeah, I mean, it is part of my presentation at the end. If you'd
Oh,
rather wait until the end, I can talk about it more then.
okay. Yeah, I'm running out of questions then.
Yeah.
Well, let's just focus. So, is there any other types of photography that you enjoy besides the ICM?
Well, I am starting to do some just straight multiple exposures, but I do prefer to use the camera creatively. And I'm starting to do some creative post-processing with my images, which I'll show some examples of that when we come back off the break. But I do prefer to see the world a little bit differently than literally. So I'm very much into finding ways to express myself more abstractly.
Hmm. And what type of software do you use for post processing?
I use Lightroom to do my general edits of my images, and then I post-process. I do the creative, things like layering and blending and things like that in Photoshop.
Hmm. And when you do the multi photos and then doing the layering, do you use pretty much all your photos? Or are there some that are just a complete disaster and they're kind of a lost cause? Or do you find other ways to use it?
Well, all of the images that I've shown you so far have all been created in the camera. Those
Mhm.
have not been done in Photoshop at all. But I am taking some of those images that maybe didn't make the cut as, things I wanted to share publicly, and taking those into Photoshop and using them to do some creative post-processing with those. But I mean, I'm not generally taking single exposures into Photoshop and blending them to make multiple exposures, because I do that in camera. So what I
Right.
do in Photoshop is take my in-camera multiple exposures into Photoshop and then push them further that way.
Hmm. Hmm. And when you go out do photography, do you purposely uh, so do you have like maybe like a scene in mind and you wanted to use those techniques and see how it goes creatively, or is it something like you kind of what I'm trying to explain is that if
I don't pre-visualize.
okay, okay, yeah, yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to
Yeah,
ask
no,
about.
I mentioned that earlier. I don't generally pre-visualize
Right.
because I feel like pre-visualizing, if you go out with a pre-visualization, you've already got an expectation of what you want to create. And
Mhm.
then if you don't end up creating that, it can make you frustrated and you might give up before you've explored all of the different possibilities. But also, it might prevent you from exploring all of the different possibilities because you're just so in the mindset that you want to do this thing. So I just like to be open and free with my approach and just start moving, see what happens, and then go from there.
Right. So while we close up, so I can have you go back to your presentation real quick. For someone who is looking to get into something like this, what are the quick recommendations that you would give to somebody that like would go if they went with you to a scene or something like that? What is the advice that you give for a new photographer getting into
Just
this?
start moving.
Yeah.
That's the best thing anybody can do, is just start moving and seeing what happens. Because the only way you're going to know what happens is by moving. And sometimes you're not going to know what the effect will be unless you just try it. So it really is this whole idea that you have to just do a lot of work, play, experiment, explore. And Dawn just said she's not sure if she understands light and dark blend mode. It can take a little bit of time to wrap your brain around, and it's probably, I do teach this whole idea of multiple exposure ICM online through Santa Fe workshops and in my, in-person workshops. And so it can be a little difficult to get to grips with it, but if you can just remember that bright blend mode, bright gets the priority, and dark blend mode, anything that's dark is going to get the priority across the sequence. So, it just takes a lot of practice, and it wasn't something that just came easily. And, I started creating images right off the bat, playing around with either of those different blending modes that I was happy with. It took a lot of practice. I've got more than 250,000 frames of ICM work in my Lightroom catalog. So I've done extensive work, and it does take that, I think. So, but bright blend mode, bright gets the priority. Dark blend mode, dark gets the priority. And if you download the presentation and you look at those slides where I have, the individual source images and the final blended image, if you will study them and see what is it, if it's bright blend mode, what's coming through of those two exposures, what's coming through in the final blended image, I think that will help. And not all cameras have the capacity to blend. No, some cameras, Sony does not have multiple exposure capability at all. So if you're a Sony user, you won't be able to do any of the multiple exposure techniques at all. Olympus has only something called overlay, I think. So they don't have bright and dark blend mode, most of the Olympus cameras. But a lot of the Canons and Nikons and Fujis do have bright, dark, average, and additive blend modes. So, it just depends on what camera make and model you have. Just to get back into the presentation, I mentioned during the break when Dan asked the question about taking images into Photoshop, I'm not taking my single exposure images, ICM images, into Photoshop and blending them to create a multiple exposure, because I like to do that kind of work in the camera. But what I am doing lately, the last few months, I'm taking my multiple exposure images that I did create in the camera into Photoshop and layering, duplicating, layering multiple times, rotating, flipping, trying different blending modes, using some layer masks, using some brushes and things like that to push them even that much further. So this is a multiple exposure image, ICM image that I did create in the camera. And probably not one that I would share necessarily on social media or, put it on my website or anything like that. But I took this into Photoshop, layered it multiple times, duplicated it multiple times, rotated it, flipped it, did a lot of different things with it. And this little piece right here looks like a fish, but I hadn't even really noticed it in the actual original image until I started resizing, flipping, moving. And then as I was doing that, it felt like I was starting to get a pool of a school of fish that were swimming around in a circle. And so that became a really cool thing for me, and very exciting to see that happen. This is another example of one single multiple exposure image that I took in the camera, which I wouldn't share necessarily as an independent image because it's not all that exciting necessarily to me. But what was exciting when I started duplicating it and flipping it and rotating it in Photoshop was that because of this very pronounced triangular point that was created from the effect of sunlight and shadow on some rocks that I was working with, I started to see these pyramid shapes emerging as I'm working in Photoshop. So that was also really fun and interesting there. And then this is just some a colorful window and a door on the side of a building in Mexico. And when I just put those together, flipped it, duplicated it, flipped it, started rotating it around, it just then started to feel like a bunch of colorful blocks kind of tumbling through the frame, which I really liked that as well. And then this particular image here is another multiple exposure ICM image I created in the camera, but then by using the duplicating and layering and flipping and all of that, and some brushes and things like that, I was able to create 3 distinctly unique individual images out of that one. So there's a lot to be said for doing some creative post-processing. And it is something that I didn't do for the longest time. I'm just learning Photoshop actually because of all of this, because I got to a point earlier this year where I felt like I need to do more. And I'm starting to feel like I can't do anything new with my camera that I haven't already done before. So how do I take what I'm doing with my camera and push it even further? Because I am one of those kinds of people that never wants to stay in one place. I always want to be pushing the boundaries. I always want to be moving forward and trying new things and creating new things and doing things I've never done before. So the creative post-processing aspect is the new element for me that's helping me take my artistry to different levels. And then mobile ICMs. I didn't do mobile ICMs. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that back in 2017 and 18, mobile ICM wasn't even a thing. But now, probably the last 3 years, it's become a thing. And so I have always been an Android user, and but Android apps are pretty limited, and that's another reason why I didn't do mobile ICMs, I think, for the longest time. But there is this Camera FV5 app, which is very fun for doing ICMs. And then I've recently, this year, learned of this Expert Raw app on the Android devices. And so you can work with these two on an Android device, and I will talk about iPhones as well, so don't worry. But in the Camera FV5 app, you would want to go to the synthetic exposure option under the menu, and then you can select whether you want to work with film type or light trail type. I would liken film type to average blend mode if in your DSLR or mirrorless camera. I would liken light trail to bright blend mode. So you don't really have a dark blend mode. I did answer that question about the blending cameras having the capacity to blend. Sony's don't have it, but a lot of the others do. Some examples of the mobile ICMs with the Camera FV5. You can see that you have a little bit more of a digital look and feel. You don't get the same smooth lines that you get with your regular camera, because mobile devices work a little bit differently than DSLR and mirrorless cameras. The shutter doesn't actually stay open for a half a second or 1 second. It's actually, the camera is actually rapidly firing off multiple exposures to fill up that amount of time. And so it does kind of have this feeling and this look of high frame rate multiple exposures, which you can see here. I do sometimes mitigate that effect by bringing the clarity way down. When I'm doing my editing in Lightroom Mobile, I'll bring the clarity down -100, and it helps to soften that. So this image here on the left, I think I did actually bring the clarity way down -100 to help soften the look of that digital effect that you get with these mobile devices. But these were both done with the camera FB5, and it's just kind of moving the camera around like this. I just play. I could probably shoot 1,000 different images in one, just walking down a street in any urban environment. So that's the images with the camera FB5. And this is an example of the difference between light trail and film type. So film type is, again, kind of like average blend mode. Light trail type is similar to bright blend mode, like you would get in your regular camera. And this is another example of that. You get a lot different look and feel using the light trail type as opposed to using the film type. And I just probably prefer the film type for the mobile ICMs, for the Android ICMs, over the light trail type personally. But this Android, this Samsung or Expert RAW app, I think it's only available on Samsung Galaxy phones. So if you have a Pixel phone or any of the other non-Samsung phones, I don't think it would be available. But you can do multiple exposures in the traditional way, like you would with your DSLR or mirrorless camera. You can select it. You can use additive, average, bright, dark blend mode. You can go up to 9 exposures. So you can use it in a similar way to the way you work with the DSLR or mirrorless camera to do multiple exposures. And these are examples of that with the same building. Each of these are the same building on the University of Iowa campus, just moving the camera in between and rotating it, click, 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 or something like that. And then changing the color temperature, because you can also play around with color temperature when you're doing multiple exposures or ICM just in general. So that's examples of that. This is also some examples using Expert RAW with a sculpture feature on the University of Iowa campus to create something different and unique. So for the iPhone, I said that I'm primarily an Android user, but I did buy an iPhone about a year ago, because I felt limited with the Android in the apps that are available for Androids. And the iPhone seems to be much more conducive and has many more creative apps available out there. So I wanted the ability to create with the iPhone and to do some things that I can't do with the Android device. So the apps that I like to use and the ones that I see most people using on iPhones are Slow Shutter Cam app and Average Cam Pro. Not a lot of people I see are using double exposure, but it is an app that I have found a lot of fun. I'd have a lot of fun playing with it. So it's something to consider as well. So with Slow Shutter Cam app, you have 3 different options. You have motion blur, light trail, and low light. And again, I would liken these to motion blur being average blend mode, light trail being bright blend mode, low light being similar to dark blend mode. They're not a one-to-one exact replication of what you get in those different blend modes in your camera, but they're similar to those effects that you get with your camera. So again, even with the iPhone and the iPhone apps, you still get this sort of digital effect, this look and feel with the images. So because of the way the shutter works, it doesn't stay open, it's firing off rapidly. And I do, again, mitigate that or minimize that effect by bringing the clarity way down in post-processing. These are inside of a museum, and you know, you always have your phone with you, so you can play around in places doing creative work with your mobile devices in places that you might not even consider taking your big camera to, or that you might not be able to take your regular camera to. So you can have a lot of fun playing with mobile devices doing ICM. Again, these are just a couple of images using slow shutter cam app and multiple exposure. This is a multiple exposure, and these two are both multiple exposures with slow shutter cam app as well. So you can do single exposures and you can do multiple exposures. With Average Cam Pro, you can do a single exposure, but it's known for being able to do multiple exposures. So I usually like to do 8, but you can go all the way up to 128. And again, it's creating an effect that feels similar to the high frame rate technique that I talked about earlier. But because of that digital effect that you get, I like to bring the clarity down in the post-processing to soften that, so they have a little bit more of a painterly look and feel to them when you bring the clarity way down. But I like the effect that I'm able to get, and you know, certainly playing around with more or less exposures is a good idea to see what happens and what you can build. Because what happens is when you press the shutter, and you say, if you have it set to 8 like I do, you press the shutter and it shows you, you can see it happening on the screen, and it counts down the exposures: 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you can build it. And in this case here, you know, it looks like there are mountains behind mountains, but there aren't. I have a before and after example of this particular scene where you'll be able to see that. But because of the way that I was framing it as I was firing off the images, I was able to create that effect of mountains behind mountains. So the double exposure, the exciting thing about the double exposure app is that it has a lot of the same blending options you would get in Photoshop. So you can still do bright and dark blend mode, but you have a whole lot of other things to choose from. Like this particular one that I'm really excited about is Phoenix, the Phoenix blend mode, and that has a look and feel kind of like infrared to me. And so you can do much more than just 2 exposures. So it's called double exposure, but I think these were probably at least 9 exposures or more using that Phoenix blending mode. So very abstract, very different kind of look and feel using the double exposure app. And again, this is that building on the University of Iowa campus that I've talked about earlier. And then these are a sculpture, which I do have a before and after to show you what that looks like as well, also on the University of Iowa campus. So a lot of things you can do with your mobile devices. The next section is going to be some before and after examples to show what a scene looked like before I did ICM, and then what it looked like after doing ICM. And I don't generally do traditional shots anymore, and so a lot of my before shots are either images I took with my mobile device or images that I took a screenshot from a video or something like that, because it's difficult to go between trying to get a straight shot and doing ICM. Because if I'm hand holding and I'm doing ICM and I'm shooting at a half a second to get a straight shot, I'm generally going to have to bump up the ISO and the exposure and the shutter speed, you know, to be able to get a sharp straight shot. So I just don't do traditional shots with my regular camera very often. But this is the scene here of this ICM, and there's pockets of ice on the water and on the sandbar, and that's helping to bring in some visual interest and some textural elements. You might look at this scene and not even pay attention to that ice, but when you start playing with ICM, it creates texture, it creates elements that from those things that you don't even pay attention to in a particular scene. This is that image we saw earlier, and this is the before scene. And what drew my attention really was just the way the light was reflecting off of the grasses on the woodland floor here. This next scene here is some colorful columns, and by doing the upside down technique, I did one exposure with the camera right side up, and then I flipped the camera upside down and did a second exposure. I'm able to bring the colorful columns into both the right and the left side of the frame, which if I'd done 2 exposures standing in the same spot, one right side up and the second one right side up, I would have only gotten these red columns. I wouldn't have gotten the color on both sides of the frame. So that's where another example of where turning the camera upside down can help you build and craft the images in a particular way. These are those tall grasses. We saw this image earlier, and this is what that particular scene looks like with the grasses and the feathery plumes on the top. But this scene this is what this scene looks like in winter time, and I go to this location at all different times of the year, and in wintertime it's not very attractive, and there's this big pile of dirt, but I'm looking at this pile of dirt and thinking, what can I do with it? Can I make something out of it? Can I create something out of that? And so just by using that twisting motion or rotating motion, I'm able to create this effect by making that pile of dirt the subject that feels like a mountain kind of rising up out of the snow, and footprints and snowmobile tracks and things like that help to add some textural elements in the foreground there. This is also a before and after sunset scene here, where I've flipped the camera upside down to bring that colorful sky into the top and the bottom of the frame. If it had just been a single exposure, the bottom part of the frame would have just been all dark because I would have had to be underexposing. So that would have just been all dark. So flipping the camera upside down helps to minimize that and bring some interest into both parts of the frame. This is the before and after example. I showed you these two as examples of bright and dark blend mode from the same scene. This is what that scene looks like, just some icicles hanging on the side of a limestone bluff. And you can see that you get 2 different effects by doing bright and dark blend mode. And so I always do recommend and encourage people to play with both, try them both. This particular scene, this was the first image I showed you when we started talking about multiple exposure ICMs. It was taken earlier in the summer, and then as the color started to change for fall, I went back to the same scene and took an image that's kind of similar, still has a fantasy feel to it, but there's a little bit more color because of the red leaves that are on the trees here. This is an example of doing both single exposure and multiple exposure. So playing with both. Don't feel like you can only do single exposure or you only can do multiple exposure. Do both, and you'll get different kinds of effects. And this is the part of the scene that I was working with. I didn't work with the grand landscape. I just worked with a small scene within the scene. And oftentimes that is what I do. I just work with a small part of the scene. This is in the middle of the day. This is probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, very high, bright sun. But by not working, by working in a way that I'm not getting any sky, and I'm just basically working with the shadows of the wooded area and this waterfall, I can still shoot in the middle of the day. Some of these highlights are probably blown out, but I don't mind that. I'm okay with that. I did underexpose, and so I tried to minimize the effect of blown out highlights. But for me, it's about that contrast of those highlights and those shadow areas. And so I'm okay with the effect that was created, even if some of those highlights are blown out. This is the scene here for this particular image, working again with the contrast between shadow and highlights, and again having to underexpose. In the original raw file, the top and the bottom of this frame here were very dark. You couldn't see any of the detail that you see here, but by underexposing, I'm not blowing out the highlights, and I'm bringing up the shadows in post-processing, and I'm not introducing a lot of noise, not a significant amount of noise. And sometimes with ICM, it's okay to have a little bit of noise anyway, because it can add a bit of a textural element or some interest in an image, just depending on, you know, the kind of noise or where it's at or what the subject is. This is again just working with a small section of this particular scene, trying to capture the energy of this water over this cascade here, and the contrast between the highlights again. This also is another scene where I'm very drawn to the highlights on the water and the shadow area of the bluff in the background. And again, playing with those highlights to create this effect, this kind of etching effect with this particular scene. This is a before and after using the camera FB5. This is the Design Museum in London, and I loved the colors and the geometry of the architecture, the way the light was pouring into this particular scene, and I loved the effect that I was able to create with my mobile device working in this particular location. This is that building on the University of Iowa campus, and this is using the Expert RAW with the Android device to create that particular image. This is a very rocky, rugged side of a cliff. And using slow shutter cam app and multiple exposure, it softens. I was able to soften the look and feel of this. You wouldn't even know that it was the side of a rocky cliff, but because the softening and the layers and the lines and the textures that come through by doing, you know, multiple exposure ICM with the mobile device just transforms it into something completely different and unique. This is that waterfall scene that I mentioned, where it looks like there's mountains behind mountains. There weren't mountains behind those mountains, but by playing with the Average Cam Pro and building it up as I go along, it created that effect. So that's Average Cam Pro before and after. This is that sculpture that I mentioned on the University of Iowa campus using the double exposure app. So that's all of the before and after examples, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what's possible. Just some things to keep in mind about ICM. Again, no rules. There are no rules. Break free of those rules, which can be very difficult, especially for those people who have, you know, led very structured lives. I lived a very structured life. My entire adult life, I was in service in the military as a federal employee and working for the University of Iowa. So I've had a very structured life myself, and it was difficult at first to just let go and be free with my camera, but when I started doing ICM, it taught me how to be free. It taught me how to let go. So don't be afraid of it. And again, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Have fun, explore, experiment, play. That is really the key with ICM. Play, 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 explore. I can't stress that enough. And do the work. My mantra, do the work. So the magazine, we talked at the break a little bit about the magazine. I just decided, I had the idea to start a project that would build a community around ICM back in 2018, as early as 2018, 2019. But the timing just wasn't right for me to make that happen until about 2020. So in 2020, I decided if I don't do this now, I'm never going to do it. So I decided to launch the ICM Photography magazine to celebrate the work that ICM photographers around the world were doing at that particular time, and to bring attention to it, because in 2020, it was still very much on the margins. It wasn't in the mainstream like it is now. And so I've had the opportunity, and it's a passion project for me. I've had the opportunity to work with hundreds of photographers from around the world, and I've always felt it very, very important to support them by paying them for their content. So I have paid every photographer in the magazine since the very beginning, and it's an advertisement-free magazine, and there are no sponsors, so it's all reader supported. I feel like it's a very grassroots kind of project and effort, because I don't want it to be about advertisement. I don't want it to be about sponsors. I want it to be about the artistry and the creativity of ICM photography. And I'm expanding that vision actually to start to move the magazine in a different direction that's going to enable or open things up for more creative types of photography that may or may not specifically be based in ICM. So some other things that I've been doing the past several months is I learned how to do cyanotypes. And so I'm taking some of my cyanotype work, which is work that you do manually without a camera, printing with the sunlight or UV light, and I'm scanning my cyanotype images and I'm blending them with some of my multiple exposure ICM images. So I'm doing a lot of new and different creative things, and I want the magazine to expand and grow with me. You know, it's my idea for the magazine is actually to redefine ICM to be, instead of intentional camera movement, which it'll always mean intentional camera movement, but I want it to also mean intentional creative moments, because I want to start to celebrate more the creativity that's involved than any specific technique. So that's kind of my vision for the future with the magazine and with my own work. And so if you are interested in seeing more of the new types of work on my website, I've got a section here called Artistic Creativity. It's got some of my cyanotype work just by itself. It's got some new work where I've blended cyanotypes with multiple exposure ICM images. And then some paintings. I've been doing some abstract painting, and I just have this vision of taking what I do in the camera just that much further by expanding and doing some things that I haven't done before. This image here is an ICM or a cyanotype that I printed using the sun, scanned it, and then blended with a multiple exposure image as well. But these are the ways you can connect with me. I'm always happy to connect and answer questions outside of these presentations. And certainly I hope that you will download the presentation and study it, especially if you have questions about some of the techniques like bright and dark blend mode and what that entails, what's getting the priority and how that affects the end results. So thank you for allowing me to ramble on for an hour and a half, and hopefully it's given you some ideas for some of the things you can do with your camera, the creativity that can be done with your camera, and that you'll get out and try some new things and explore and experiment yourself. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was excellent. I knew so little about ICM, and you've really got me excited about going out and trying new things.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad. Oh, and thank you for the kind comments in the chat as well. I love that what you just said, Valerie, a work of heart. Oh, that just gives me goosebumps actually, because we all know the phrase work of art, but that's a new and fresh take on that, and I love it. Work of heart. Thank you very much for that.
And just to remind people, ICM is the assigned category in March, so you have plenty of time to practice and get the picture that you really want to submit there. And I think Stephanie is coming back to judge that day.
I am, yes.
So that will be exciting, and we'll get to see you again.
No pressure.
None at all. We're a very laid back.
I know. I'm just joking. What are my typical camera settings? Well, I had them on all of the slides. I had the settings for all of the different images on the slide. So if you download the presentation, you'll be able to look at each of those images and see what my settings were. But I don't ever like to say that there's a particular setting that you should work with, because it's situation dependent. It's subject dependent. You know, it's not necessarily always going to be the same. You have to understand, of course, the exposure triangle and how to make adjustments to get an exposure that's going to work for you. But certainly, if you download the presentation, you'll be able to see all of those different settings that I work with for all of the images that I shared.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. So who are we having? So next week is going to be the
Next
not
week is the board meeting.
the executive board
so
meeting. All right. So if
if
no one
people-
else,
I'm sorry, go on, Dan.
let's say if anybody wants to go to that, we definitely encourage just to see what the executive board meeting does, and you know, make the decisions, and also be involved. I highly suggest it. I did it for quite a number of years before I became the vice president, and you get a lot more of understanding of how the club runs. So back to you.
And the competition the week after that, don't forget, that is on Zoom now. It is no longer in the church. Don't go to the church. Tune into Zoom for that competition. Anybody else have any questions for Stephanie? I think a lot of people are going to be joining your Facebook and all the other things.
Great. Well, I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank
Thank you very much. Good night, everybody, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for competition.
Couple weeks.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Have a good night.
Thank
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.